Good evening. My name is Liz Plater-Zyberg, and I am the faculty member who's been coordinating the Vincent Scully seminar, in which this is the next to the last presentation this spring. So welcome, everyone. We're happy to see you here to hear from a very interesting speaker today. I should point out that we are live streaming these presentations, so there will be an audience elsewhere, and therefore the speaker is asked to stay close to the microphone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Neil Brenner, who's a professor of urban design at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He's been in Miami speaking in the geography department. You'll see as he lectures that his background and his knowledge and his interests span across many disciplines as they relate to cities and urbanism. He's part of the Urban Theory Lab at Harvard and has numerous publications on the topic. I think he would say that as his teaching and writing focuses on the theoretical aspects of urban topics in what might be called the field of critical urban and regional studies, I would add to that they're actually global, judging by our visit to the Port of Miami. So this afternoon, the students in this class, along with Professor Brenner and myself, spent a very interesting time with some of the leaders at the port discussing the role of the port, our city, within the larger global network. And I think you'll begin to get the idea of how interesting, and maybe you're going to be telling us to some degree unknown, those connections, those global connections are. So recent publications, a critique of urbanization, selected essays published in 2016, and still to come out, New Urban Spaces, Urban Theory, and the Scale Question. We were talking about scale, the bigness of things in our last discussions. I need to divert for 1 minute to point out that there's a piece of paper on the table, which is the continuing education sign-in sheet. We've had CEU people interested in the CEUs in prior sessions, so maybe at the end of the session you can come down and sign in. At any rate, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Neil Brenner, and I've asked him to tell you a little bit more about himself. We always ask the speakers in this seminar to say a little bit about how their interests emerge and how they come to be doing what they're doing today, to help our students imagine how their career trajectories might evolve. Neil?
So thank you very much, Liz, for that introduction. Thanks to Liz for the invitation and to Rudy for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here. We had a wonderful and very fascinating visit to the port today. It raised a lot of interesting questions, and we had some very interesting dialogues. And thanks to all of you for being here. It's Friday night in Miami, and there's a lot of stuff going on, so I'm honored that, that people want to come and hear a little bit about critical urban theory. So in terms of my trajectory into some of the arguments that I'm going to be developing tonight, a lot could be said, but let me just say a couple things without necessarily knowing how to connect them to one another. So one thing to say is that I actually grew up in Lakeland, Florida. So I'm kind of a Floridian. I lived in Florida from age 6 until I went to college. And it's the kind of thing where you don't realize how formative a certain experience is in your life until maybe many years later. So I think a lot more about that particular geography of urbanization these days in relation to many of my theoretical reflections. Maybe we can come back to that during the course of the discussion. And the one other thing, just as a way to situate myself, and I'll have a lot more to say about this as I develop the lecture. So my PhD is actually in political science, and I worked for many years at NYU in the sociology department and teaching in an undergraduate urban studies program. So I come out of the social sciences and critical geography, and about 7 years ago, give or so, I was appointed to teach urban theory at the GSD. I had engaged with planning and design before that through my work and through my kind of professional and academic dialogues, but never as directly until I started teaching in a design school. And it's been quite fascinating and transformative for me in a lot of ways, which most of you didn't know me from before I moved to the GSD, but which I certainly would be happy to talk about after I present some of my remarks tonight. And then I think, as you know, I'll be talking again on Monday night. There's a lot of visual materials in these presentations. I'm very interested in the relationship between urban theory and spatial visualization. And that's something that I was interested in earlier, but which I've dug a lot deeper into since starting to work in a design school. But I want to start by, as I've said, I teach urban theory. I'm a theorist. So I want to start with just that, with the question of theory. I've been teaching theory for a long time, even before I moved to Harvard. And in teaching theory over the years in many different contexts, I get a lot of resistance. I get a lot of resistance to theory. So as I've experienced resistance to certain kinds of theory that I'm trying to develop in my research and in my teaching, I reflect on the nature of the resistance. Why this resistance to theory? It's a long story. It's quite an interesting story. But for purposes of this talk, I would boil it down to two particular positions which I think are quite prevalent in the design disciplines, and which in some ways, at least to one of them, I'm pretty sympathetic to. So the first form of resistance to theory is, I put Lenin, what is to be done up there, but it takes many different forms. But it's basically a kind of orientation towards practice. The idea that theory is a luxury and a distraction from enabling us to confront the fundamental questions of changing the world. Many students study design because they want to change the world. I think that's a great reason to work in the design disciplines, because we want to reconfigure built environments and the social relations of the built environment. And from this point of view, theory is sometimes viewed as a distraction. So I teach regularly a history theory course that's required for a lot of students in some of the professional degree programs at the GSD. And they, in general, when you're required to take a course, maybe you resist it because it's a requirement, just as a matter of principle. But I think there's a particular kind of resistance from many students who really, they want to get down to business of learning sort of urgent technical disciplines in order to confront questions of social and political change. So that's one form of resistance to theory. And another parallel, sometimes connected form of resistance to theory has to do with the rise of big data. So I put up this image from Wired magazine about 10 years ago, declaring the end of theory because of the data deluge, the development of new computer technologies and new data processing techniques, which it is claimed render theory obsolete. You no longer need a theory because we have machinery, we have computational software that can basically reveal the regularities, the causal laws that underpin the core processes we're trying to understand. So why engage in kind of metaphysical speculation about theory when we have big data? It's irrelevant. And a form of that position that I find pretty prevalent in planning and design has to do with geospatial data. Like, all of us now have access to massive amounts of geospatial data, and it's really quite revolutionary in terms of what we can do with it in terms of spatial visualization. And that is often coupled with, articulated to, a strong resistance to theory. In other words, let's dig through the spatial data and see what emerges on the map and use that as kind of the core guide to understanding what needs to be done. So that's an increasingly prevalent form of resistance to theory that's also being institutionalized in a lot of disciplines that are investing in kind of new forms of data science. So there are many other forms of resistance to theory, but I think in the design disciplines in particular, those two forms, the orientation towards practice, theory as distraction, and the turn to kind of big data and geospatial science, they lead many students and practitioners to bracket questions of theory. So I'm biased about these matters. I'm deeply committed to theory. I teach theory. I think I fully disagree with, I fully oppose those positions. And I just want to frame my visit here around explaining to you why I reject those positions and why I think theory is actually fundamental to all dimensions of design thinking and design practice. From my point of view, I want to argue we are never outside the realm of theory. We are always inside the realm of theory. The question is how reflexive, how critically reflexive might we be about the theoretical assumptions that we always already presuppose. So I'll develop that just with reference to three kind of opening propositions, which are both opening in relation to my presentation tonight, but also in relation to the lecture I'll be giving on Monday. So first proposition, for me, theory is not opposed to practice. It's part of practice. Theory is a basis for deciphering life. It's the only basis on which we can conceptualize practices and histories. And as I already said, we can be more or less reflexive about our theoretical and interpretive frameworks. And that's the key question. But they're always already present in all dimensions of everyday and professional thought and action, I would argue. So that's proposition one. It's a particular conception of theory. It's a form of interpretive understanding. It's a kind of semiotics of existence and of practice. Second proposition, interpretations, theories, shape the production of space. So every key concept in the field of architecture, urban design, planning, urbanism, it has a contested history. Its meaning evolves through struggle over time. And those struggles over interpretations are essential to the production of space. To build on the ideas of Stuart Hall, kind of cultural theorist, interpretations are a material force. So this whole divide between the interpretive and the material, I'm not so sure that that's very illuminating. Interpretations are part of the material realm. They shape and reshape the very reality they strive to render intelligible. And again, I think this applies to every key concept in architecture, urban design, planning. It has a contested history, and the contestation over the meaning of key terms like city, like urban, like density, to choose a couple examples, like sustainability, we could go on. Those struggles have massive implications over not only what we do, what we can do, what we think is possible, our understanding of the realm of possible transformation. So again, to quote Stuart Hall, theory and interpretations in that sense are a terrain of ideological struggle. And these propositions lead to a third one, which is that theory or interpretations directly animate political struggles and political values. Theory is connected to political struggle of various kinds, the struggle for the just city, the good life, the right to the city, social justice, sustainability. And very helpful here is actually a distinction. It comes from Aristotle, but it's been used very productively by a Danish planning theorist who teaches now at Oxford named Bent Flyvbjerg, between techne, episteme, and phronesis. So techne is basically technical knowledge, how to do something, how things work. And episteme is basically scientific knowledge. It's the search for causes, so what explains particular outcomes. But Aristotle, and then more recently Flyvbjerg, distinguished that from phronesis, which roughly translates, according to Flyvbjerg, as practical wisdom. It's basically the realm of normative thinking about why we are doing what we are doing. It's kind of the goals in a normative sense. And theory is essential to all of these different dimensions of knowledge. Like certainly we need theory to do technical, practical interventions. And we certainly need theory in order to develop science, the search for causes. But equally important, and I would argue in some ways even more important for the design disciplines, given their role in shaping and reshaping built environment, are questions of norms and politics. And I'm someone who believes both in the realm of research and in the realm of teaching, it's very important to put those normative questions on the table. And one of the key agendas or goals of design research and design teaching is to help frame and clarify precisely debates about norms and values, and to clarify debates about norms and values that are ongoing in society in and around the built environment. So in this sense, theory can facilitate new forms of consciousness. Again, I'm relying on some formulations from Stuart Hall, new conceptions of the world. So this, in a certain way, comes full circle to where I began about how theory is not separate from practice. For me, theory, and by the way, this is a conception that's in some ways inspired by Frankfurt School, in particular by the work of Theodor Adorno. So it gets into kind of German Marxian, certain strands of Western Marxist philosophy. In this sense, theory is very much connected to the search for possible alternative worlds that we might construct. Theory is precisely about the one function of theory is to help us excavate openings for political alternatives. And by the way, that's a conception of theory that's not only essential to some of the work of someone like Adorno, but also to a very spatial thinker who's been really inspirational for a lot of my research and writing, Henri Lefebvre. The whole question of the possible as a horizon for theory. So all of that by way of just framing, like, who am I, what am I about, what are my core agendas? This kind of conception basically underpins everything that I do in my teaching and in my research. So I'm all about theory matters. Let's bring theory into the heart of a lot of the discussions that we're having about very applied questions. So when I moved to Harvard, to the GSD 6.5, 7 years ago, I set up the Urban Theory Lab, which even as the title of the lab, it's intended to be a little bit of a provocation. Because usually, of course, we think of a lab as a kind of group of researchers who are oriented towards either a very applied kind of question or towards, a classic scientific method model of testing hypotheses empirically and developing research in a particular avenue. I'm deeply interested in application. I'm deeply interested in empirical research. But in a certain way, the goal of this little research lab is not only application and empirical research, but to test out concepts. So one of the big arguments that I'm trying to make in a lot of my work right now is that the inherited framework of inherited approaches to urban questions and theories of urbanization, I want to argue, are increasingly obsolete, or at least out of sync with dramatic socio-spatial and ecological transformations that we're seeing all around the world. So therefore, to the degree that a research group forms to try to test out alternative conceptualizations, that can be actually quite productive in relation to both application and empirical research. So again, that's a bold claim, and I've got to unpack it and justify a lot of the elements. I realize that's hopefully it's provocative, and I want to develop it. I'm lucky to be able to offer you 2 lectures instead of just 1, because it gives me a little more opportunity to develop that kind of an argument. So tonight's lecture is going to kind of, in a certain way, illustrate the conception of theory that I just outlined in very general terms, but mainly by way of a critique of inherited approaches to urban theory, which I'll explain in great detail in the next half an hour or so, what exactly I mean when I say that inherited approaches to the urban question are obsolete or out of sync with ongoing socio-spatial transformations. I'll develop that. But then on Monday night, hopefully many of you can come back for that as well. I'll develop in more detail some of my ideas about an alternative conceptualization of planetary urbanization and extended urbanization. So it's kind of a 2-part lecture, although for those of you who can't be there Monday, I'll give you a few hints and start to develop some of my ideas about the alternative, which obviously are going to already be implicit within the critique that I'm going to develop. So I just want to start in terms of the uses of urban theory and this conception of theory that I've been developing. I want to illustrate it with reference to a widely prevalent, I would call it, urban spatial ideology. And that's basically a proposition that we hear all around us almost all the time in newspaper articles, in grant proposals, in all kinds of different media related to design and urbanism, namely the idea that the world has become urban, that we live in an urban world. So is this a self-empirical fact, or is it actually a highly contentious argument or claim? I'm going to argue it's not self-evident at all, and it may indeed be misleading depending on what you understand under that particular rubric. So again, it's so widely in circulation that I probably don't even need to spend too much time just kind of summarizing the claim, but I just kind of want to sort of motivate and animate this presentation a little bit by just reviewing a little bit how prevalent that claim is and in what forms it is being articulated and by whom. So obviously the World Urban Forum, the United Nations, which I'm going to have a lot to say about, UN Habitat, urban age debates from my friends and colleagues at the LSE who have a whole kind of worldwide conference series on the urban age. Some years ago, Rem Koolhaas opened one of his widely influential books, Mutations, by quoting the UN, like most people do in developing this proposition, with reference to the idea that we live in a majority urban world because we've crossed a kind of 50% population threshold. So he says, again, he's quoting the Global Urban Observatory, which at that time was, I believe, part of UN Habitat. At the outset of the 20th century, 10% of the population lived in cities. Around 2000, it's 50%, and then around 2025, and there are various projections for the future, but basically that number is going to grow. And various versions of the same thing. So the Endless City, an important book published by the LSE Deutsche Bank Urban Age Project, they use this kind of 50% population threshold as a graphic design, almost branding device for explaining what their project is about. In fact, within that book, there are a lot of different conceptions of the urban age and urbanization, many of which focus on this idea of the 50% population threshold, many of which don't. And this is what the editors of the book say in framing it, which, again, it's just typical of literally thousands of such formulations that are out there. Given that more than half the world's population is now living in cities, a number that's likely to reach 75% by 2050, et cetera, urban questions have become truly global ones with significant consequences for the future of our planet. I should note that this particular meta-narrative, because that's really what it is, it's not just a claim, it's a whole meta-narrative about our planetary condition. It's not only prevalent within mainstream or institutional urban discourses. It's also prevalent within the left and within the field of critical urban studies that I work in. So a couple examples. Manuel Castells, again, this is 15 years ago, but he opens one of his books by basically invoking the same proposition. Our blue planet is fast becoming a predominantly urban world, and et cetera, et cetera. He's basically just repeating the idea that there's a major world historical transformation that's happened because of this mass migration of people from the countryside to the city. Another example from critical urban studies and the kind of Marxist left is Mike Davis, very critical theorist as well, but he begins an otherwise, I think, extremely powerful and illuminating book with reference to another version of this proposition. The exact event is unimportant. It will pass entirely unnoticed, but it will constitute a watershed in human history. For the first time in history, the urban population of the world will outnumber the rural. Cities have absorbed nearly 2/3 of the global population explosion since 1950, and so on. Again, it's a familiar claim. The authoritative source for these arguments is UN Habitat, which has been trying to develop, as I'll explain in a moment, data sets on global urbanization for the better part of 50 years. World Urbanization Prospects is published every couple of years, and this is just a chart from the most recent one, actually the penultimate one, so not yet updated, from 2012. But basically, if you look at all of the World Urbanization Prospects from recent decades, you'll see different versions of this chart with different data plugged in. You've basically got two options within this framework. You're either urban or you're rural, and this diagram just tells you by global region and time frame the changing percentage urban versus rural. Here's another version of the same thing. We've now got dots on the map corresponding to the locations of large population centers, but each country in the world is basically color-coded according to the percentage of its population that is said to be urban. Here's another version of the same thing, which I won't even unpack. So basically, I want to argue that this idea of the urban age and a majority urban world is a global urban spatial ideology. What I mean by that is that it is a doxic, that is to say it's a taken-for-granted imaginary and reference point for understanding and mapping the global urban condition. And it's, again, it's presupposed in social science and ecological science, in design discourse. But I want to argue it requires further interrogation and analysis. And that's what I want to do. So for me, when I say that it's an ideology, I'm not saying that it's an illusion, it's false consciousness. It expresses, there's something going on that I think we need to understand, the sort of widespread embrace of this idea of a global urban age and a majority urban world. It embodies the popular and scholarly need to develop a meta-narrative, a cognitive map, to use that Kevin Lynch concept, for understanding a dynamically changing, volatile world. So part of what we need to do in relation to such a prevalent spatial ideology is unpack, that is to say, reveal the content of this spatial ideology to understand ongoing transformations. So for me, the critique of this urban ideology is a kind of springboard into a broader conversation about how might we go about reconceptualizing global urbanization, planetary urbanization, in ways that are maybe more productive. And I can't resist but give you just a little snippet from Henri Lefebvre on the relationship between space and ideology, which I think is very informative. What Lefebvre says is this is from 1976. Space is not a scientific object removed from ideology and politics. It has always been political and strategic. So when Lefebvre says space, he's not just talking about a platform or container. He's talking about a project and a struggle that's political. I find that very productive. And then he says something very interesting, which is about what do we make of situations when space looks apolitical, neutral, and scientific. What he says in this quote is exactly then we know that something strategic and important is going on, which is perhaps being hidden. So he says if space has an air of neutrality and indifference, it is precisely because this space has already been occupied and planned. It's already been the focus of past strategies of which we cannot always find traces. So I find this a fascinating and very generative perspective. Precisely when space looks self-evident and obvious, it could be the way a room is organized, a building, a neighborhood, a streetscape, a region, a territory. It could be a spatial discourse like the ones I'm discussing with you here. Precisely then, we need to look for the traces of strategic intervention that have occupied and transformed the space in order to try to depoliticize it. And I think the urban age discourse is precisely such an example. So space is political and ideological. So a couple steps in this presentation, which I'm actually not going to get into 3 and 4 in much detail, and that'll come at you on Monday night. So I want to spend a little time, it turns out to be quite informative, working on the genealogy of this idea of a majority urban world. The history of that concept is actually quite informative. And then I'll develop my critique, and that'll really be the core of this lecture, the rest of this lecture, with just a few hints at some of the ideas that I'm going to be developing, that I've been developing, related to an alternative conceptualization. So in terms of the genealogy, so in working on this with my colleague at the ETH, Christian Schmidt, as part of a collaboration with him on planetary urbanization, we took the time to actually excavate the history of attempts in the social sciences and in demography to measure the world's urban population. When, why, and for whom did the world's, not just the world's population, but the world's urban population, when did that become a concern and become a problem? Absolutely fascinating exploration. And what we found out was that the first person to really systematically try to do this was a very influential American sociologist and demographer who taught for many years at Columbia and then at Berkeley, named Kingsley Davis. He was the one who really spent probably 3 decades, roughly from the late 1940s until kind of the mid-1970s, working on this problem. Most important for our purposes here, which I'm going to develop this in some detail, but it turns out to have very important implications for how we think about the debate on urbanization today. So bear with me on this point, because it's a little technical and historically specific, but it turns out to have surprising implications. Most importantly, aside from his attempt to develop kind of a data set, Kingsley Davis had a conception of urbanization, namely this one. He formalized the definition of urbanization as the growth of populations living within cities and towns. And this, in yellow, this kind of algebraic equation is basically his summary of that proposition. So urbanization is basically a ratio. The total population living within cities relative to the total population, and by total population, he means total national population. So urbanization rates in Kingsley Davis's model, and I'm going to argue in a little while in the United Nations contemporary model, they fully depend on national population levels. It's always a ratio of population of cities to population of national territories. So this is the dominant definition of urbanization that Kingsley Davis introduced in the 1940s when he was trying to measure the urban population of Latin America and India, and I'm going to argue that is still the hegemonic definition of urbanization in the world today, which is kind of shocking in a lot of ways. But let me just give you a little historical background on this. So in the 1950s, Kingsley Davis already formulated the urban age idea, the notion that we would soon live in a majority urban world. And based on his data sets, he actually predicted when it would occur. He says the human species, this sounds like Mike Davis 2003, except it's 1955 Kingsley Davis, not Mike Davis. He says the human species is moving rapidly in the direction of an almost exclusively urban existence. At the 1950 to 1960 rate, the term urbanized world will be applicable well before the end of the century. So it turns out pretty accurate, at least from the point of the UN, which declares that the threshold was passed in 2003. He says, so this is just a quick glance at his data tables. This diagram basically depicts urbanization rates in a number of national contexts from the 1800s to the mid-20th century. But most importantly for our purposes, you may be wondering, based on what I've said so far, he's defined urbanization as the population of cities relative to the population of national territories. How the heck does he define the city? Good question. What Kingsley Davis decided to do, he's a very pragmatic urban demographer. He concluded that there was no theoretical basis on which to come up with a universally or ontologically valid population threshold. So he decided, for reasons that are hard to excavate from what he's written, because he just kind of makes the decision and then uses certain thresholds, he decided to use 20,000 and 100,000 for all of his data accumulations. So in the top diagram, you've got a 100,000 population threshold, and then he does another number crunching exercise based on a much lower population threshold. And basically, he and his colleagues, his graduate students, attempted for the better part of a couple decades to develop the first kind of standardized data set based on a universally applicable set of urban population thresholds, 20,000 and 100,000 for every country in the world. So this is from Doxiadis, not from Davis. But it's just to kind of contextualize it. This is a moment in kind of Cold War capitalism when there's a lot of ongoing debate about so-called population overshoot and demographic change and kind of what we might now call the carrying capacity of the planet. So it's very interesting within that broader kind of global discourse about population growth that there emerges in the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s a specific concern with cities as a key kind of terrain within which these new demographic dynamics were playing out. Again, always opposed to the rural, to the countryside. So many other sociologists, demographers, geographers, and so forth tracked, using Davis's method, the evolution of world urban population. So Homer Hoyt, a very important land economist in the Chicago School, tried his hand at it. Brian Barry, a very important economic and quantitative geographer from, at that time, working at the University of Chicago, tried his hand at it. But basically, they all plug in data using the identical method that Kingsley Davis used. So this is from a very famous article on urbanization and economic development, a very contemporary theme from Brian Barry, 1961, where he basically uses the 20,000 and 100,000 urban population threshold. This is from 1969, Department of Economic and Social Affairs, United Nations, and this is the first time in which the UN started to try to measure the world's urban population, not just the world's population, but they were using exactly Davis's method. And again, it's this debate on the so-called population bomb and the expansion of world population. In the midst of this, there are a few other kind of experiments. I'm not trying to say that everyone uniformly embraced this kind of Kingsley-Davis demographic concept. This is something I found from the New York Regional Plan Association from the mid-60s, and it's a fascinating visualization because it's obviously, they tried to create a density map instead of just population levels, actual density, and using, of course, the Buckminster-Fuller Dymaxion. So just to indicate, like, there are counter trends and other approaches, but basically the hegemonic conceptualization, the hegemonic theorization that underpins mainstream global urban discourse from this period forward is the idea of urbanization, as the growth of cities. So they call it urbanization, but it's basically a theory of cityization. So in German, you can make that distinction. You can say Verstädterung, where the German word is for city is Stadt, so that means cityization. And then Urbanisierung is a different concept. It's literally urbanization. But in English, that gets basically flattened, and when we say urbanization, it basically means, in most mainstream urban discourse, cityization. And Kingsley-Davis is in some ways at the root of that, or at least one of the intellectuals who formalized that in a way that rendered the concept widely applicable in diverse global contexts. So by the 1980s, the UN is starting to predict the urban age. And I've got a few quotes from the UN from the 1980s and 1990s, just articulating different versions of the proposition of a majority urban world. But I'm going to skip the quotes, actually, because I want to give you my critique. So just trust me, the UN, I think you know at this point, the UN keeps repeating different versions of the Kingsley-Davis idea of a majority urban world. And I showed you this already in terms of just this opposition between places where there are cities and then the rest of the world as countryside or rural. So let me just skip a lot of this and just briefly, this map is just simply to underscore my point, which is that so this is from the most recent World Urbanization Prospects, the one on the bottom, and the one on the top, the two on the top are from the 1960s. Basically, the analytic lens through which the UN and its various demographers and urbanists have been wrestling with the problem of global urbanization, it hasn't changed very much. We've got a lot of new data, but the analytic lens, the framework, is basically unchanged. Thus, we get this kind of notion of global urban age, majority urban world, repeated again and again, referring to the authoritative source of the United Nations. Okay, so now, hopefully the maybe more fun part, the critique. So basically, I think this is disastrous. I think it's misleading, and it obfuscates what's going on in the world. It undermines our ability to understand urbanization, both in relation to cities and large population centers, as well as to the so-called rural areas. So I think we need to really take a step back from this framework, critically deconstruct it, and develop some alternatives. So let me start with just on empirical grounds. And these empirical problems have less to do with Kingsley-Davis, kind of the founder of some of these approaches, than with the particular constraints that the UN is operating under in terms of developing a global urban data set. So there's a continued use of urban population thresholds, which are derived from half a century ago, 20,000 and 100,000. We need to ask whether those are too high, too low, and of course the question is also spatial. How do you draw the boundaries? Depending on how you draw the boundaries, the population size is going to completely change. So it's also just not clear what we're measuring because the units of analysis themselves radically fluctuate. And that occurs not only between countries, but as everyone knows, within countries. So like a city like Jacksonville has very, very wide municipal boundaries. But that's a very exceptional situation in the United States. So that's a fundamental problem. Second problem is that Even though Kingsley Davis was pretty clear that he couldn't give a theoretical justification, he was very pragmatic, other advocates of this particular perspective are less reflexive and careful. They present this demographic approach and certain standardized population thresholds without any kind of justification, as if they were self-evidently true. But it's basically a methodological placeholder for data collection. And we've got to critically interrogate, we've got to confront the question of what is the actual size of the unit that we're analyzing. But the problem, at least within the UN's data sets, the problem of the urban population threshold, the UPT, gets even messier because, as many of you will know, the United Nations, in collecting its data on a lot of things, but certainly for cities, it has to rely on nationally specific census criteria. So each national census decides its own criteria for measuring its urban or city population. And what we see aggregated in the UN's declarations about world urban population, they're elaborate aggregations of National Census Bureau data which diverge in their criteria of what they're measuring dramatically. So they diverge wildly. And let me just give you some examples. So Mexico is 74% or 67% urban in 2000, depending on whether an urban population threshold of 2,500 or 15,000 is used. China is an excellent example and a very troubling one. Its urbanization rate is either 24%, 31%, or 73%. And again, this is a long time ago, 1999, depending on which of the three official urban designations is used. And as many of you will know, China regularly changes its official definition of urban. And that has massive implications for the urbanization rate. Sometimes it changes simply by definitional fiat, not because anything has really changed. Among many other issues, empirical issues that emerge in the case of China. And there are many other examples of this from other countries in the world. And an author, a scholar at the World Bank, Chandan Doiskar, took the time to actually tabulate all the different urban population thresholds that are used by different national census bureaus in the UN's data tables. So they go as low as 200. So in some countries, Iceland is one of them. If a settlement has 200 people, it's urban. So, okay. And then, obviously, a lot have 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, and then a few go as high as 50,000. So it now appears that actually Kingsley Davis's 100,000 isn't that popular. The 20,000 is somewhat popular, but the more important point is simply that within the data tables, there's incredible heterogeneity. But it gets even more messy because, again, as many of you will know, countries measure their urban population, their urban population not only in terms of absolute population levels, they also use other criteria which vary dramatically. Sometimes density, sometimes it's simply a governmental criterion. You decide that this area is urban because of its function within governmental administration. Sometimes there are employment criteria, like level of agricultural or non-agricultural employment. So David Satterthwaite, a critical demographer, summarizes the problem quite, I think, concisely. He says, the scale of the world's urban population is strongly influenced by the criteria used within the largest population of nations. If the Indian or Chinese government chose to change the urban criteria in their censuses, this could increase or decrease the world's level of population, the world's level of urbanization by several percentage points. That's an astonishing situation. In other words, if India or Brazil or Indonesia or China change their definition, then we suddenly no longer live in a 50% or 51%. Maybe it goes down or maybe it goes up, simply by virtue of the definition. So this, for the students in the room, is a beautiful example of a statistical artifact. So in other words, the urbanization rate is an artifact of the way you configure the statistical definitions. It's not that nothing is being measured, but it's significantly influenced by the definition of the entity. It gets even trickier. So let me just give one slightly more focused illustration from the case of India. So India has a very peculiar definition of urbanization. So on the one hand, there's a governmental criterion, all places which the government designates as census towns. But most interesting are the second set of criteria. So first, there's a population threshold, 5,000. Second, they've got a, well, let me go to the third. They've got a density criterion, which again, that's pretty standard. They choose 400 people per square kilometer. The second one is unique to India. No other country in the world has this. 75% male non-agricultural employment. So we can spend a lot of time unpacking that. I'll spend just a moment unpacking it. So first of all, the employment of women is irrelevant to whether a place is urban or not. We can debate about that. But also, very interestingly, the claim is basically that if a place has a lot of agricultural employment, not just 50%, not just 65%, but 70%, it still classifies as rural. So my colleague Nikos Katsikis and I worked on this a bit, and he generated some visualizations to illustrate the issue. So this is basically the map of India based on the census towns and the population density criterion of 400 per square kilometer. And another student and colleague of mine, Saurav Biswas, added, actually, I beg your pardon, I got it wrong. This one is basically the 5,000, these are the places with 5,000 people, just the population size. So that's criterion 1 only. So this is from Saurav Biswas, where he adds population size, 5,000 or more, population density, 400 per square kilometer. So without the agricultural employment, non-agricultural employment criterion. And suddenly you see a much bigger zone of India being urbanized. And here's one other geospatial image that kind of gets at some of these issues. This is ambient population density. So you see not just statically the density of where people live, but based on where they move around during the working day. If you were a Martian and you looked at this map of India without necessarily knowing what was going on, you would think that the Ganges Plain is one of the largest megacities on the planet, because it's a pretty high density area, even though there's obviously a lot of agricultural production going on. And here's one other geospatial visualization into the same thing, which also speaks to alternative criteria of urbanization. This is a map from the World Bank, which measures basically connectivity infrastructures. And it's an attempt to visualize the ability of people to access a large population center within a couple of hours. And if you use that criterion, then all of India starts to look like an integrated urban fabric. Instead of just urban-rural divide, it almost completely disappears. So here the criterion is accessibility and connectivity. Okay, it's 7:30. We started a little bit after 6:30, so I'm hoping, can we go, I want to give you my theoretical critique. This is kind of still framing. I need maybe another 10 minutes, but I'm sensitive to the fact that it's Friday night and you've all been very patiently listening. So, okay, that's good to know, because I don't want to lose my audience. Theoretical problems underpin all of the empirical issues that I just raised. Number one, the status of the urban and even the city is a qualitative concept. What is the specificity of places with large populations, with dense populations, with non-agricultural populations? In other words, if we're going to measure, if we're going to claim that this historical transition to an urban world or to an urban country is fundamental, we need to explain what that actually means instead of just assuming that it's important. But too often, that's just taken for granted rather than unpacked. And once we unpack it, once we start to unpack it, we get into a pretty interesting conversation, but that doesn't happen enough. Just as importantly for me, and this will be really my main theme on Monday night, the status of the rural. I'm going to argue on Monday that we should not throw out, but seriously, critically distance ourselves from the concept of the rural. It's a black box. It's overused and abused, and it becomes almost meaningless. What is the specificity? In this context, I would ask, what is the specificity of places with small or low populations? And are they really outside of urbanization processes the way the Kingsley Davis United Nations World Bank model, not always World Bank model, the mainstream global urban model presupposes. This whole model basically, as we saw from the very first visualization that I put up of the United Nations dividing world population into urban and rural, it completely brackets what's actually going on in those zones and treats those zones as basically disconnected from urbanization, except insofar as they lose population to urban areas for reasons which aren't really explored or unpacked. And then finally, the status of the transformation. In other words, the claim is that we've crossed this world historical threshold. That's what the United Nations claims. That's what Manuel Castells claims. That's what Mike Davis claims. And that's what many other mainstream global urbanists claim. But if it's a fundamental world historical transformation, we need to know what it's actually about and why it matters. So I want to argue that there are some blind fields of this urban age discourse. So there are some underlying, I began the lecture by saying that theory is everywhere. We always presuppose theory, meta-conceptual, meta-theoretical assumptions. So I now want to kind of bring those into relief. In other words, I've moved through some empirical critiques and raised some theoretical questions. But I want to argue that there's actually a fairly robust and indeed fairly problematic set of theoretical assumptions that underpins the line of argumentation that I've been outlining here. So I'll outline a couple blind fields. First is, I would call it settlement fetishism. It's basically the idea that all spaces in the world are differentiated among settlement types that are universally replicated. So city, you could add other settlement types, suburb, town, countryside or rural, wilderness. But basically each of these zones is kind of separate containers that interact with each other, but they're fundamentally distinct. And even as society changes, those containers basically they persist as such. So yes, society changes, the distribution of people and infrastructure and investment between those containers gets reshuffled, but the containers themselves are basically universally replicated. So for a spatial theory, for a theory of spatial change, it's remarkably static on questions of space, I would argue. Second point, in urban-rural continuum or opposition, so I've alluded to this before, earlier in the lecture, all spaces in the world are seen to be either urban or rural, or must be classified someplace on that continuum. So one question that I'm going to be developing on Monday is what happens to our conception of the urban if we don't oppose it to a putative outside? What happens? It actually turns out to be controversial, but also potentially productive. So the urban as a process, rather than as a settlement unit that's opposed to other types of settlement units. I find that very productive. Third blind field is a distributional model of urban transition. So again, spatial change involves the redistribution of population between these containers, but the containers themselves don't change. The best way to summarize that point is it's like an hourglass. The sand moves from one part of the hourglass to the other. Obviously, more sand goes into the hourglass because population is growing in terms of demography, but basically the structures themselves don't change. So I found this, I guess you younger people in the room will call it is it a meme or a mime? I don't know the right word, but it's basically like an image that you plug in different phrases. So a Dutch designer named Jeroen Beckmans came up with this, and it summarizes, or at least kind of expresses my own frustration, that this idea more than half the world's population now lives in cities, and Batman is kind of like, shut up. I don't know if I would say shut up, probably wouldn't, but I sometimes feel a little frustrated because even authors who embrace a very different conception of sociospatial and ecological change and of the role of kind of planning and design and trying to mediate that sometimes use this as a frame to try to attract attention to their research or get funding, but it turns out to be highly obfuscatory and limiting. How do we get out of it? Let me outline a few escape routes and give you a hint, a little bit more than a hint, of the route that I'm trying to develop, which, again, I'll develop in more detail in the next lecture. So strategy one, each of these escape routes has some advantages. Strategy one is to say, okay, let's abandon the idea of the threshold, but continue to explore urban population levels and how they're spatially distributed. And there's a fascinating field of critical urban demography that's using sophisticated geospatial tools to confront this question. And I read a lot of that stuff, and I find it really useful. It's still focused on population distribution, and sometimes still embraces an urban-rural divide or ontology, which I find less useful. But certainly we can come up with more nuanced approaches to analyzing the spatial distribution of population. So that would be strategy one. And again, like, I think it can open up some productive avenues. Strategy two is also geospatial, but it involves a broadening of the criteria for measuring urbanization. And this we see a lot of in the design disciplines, a lot of really creative work in terms of using ambient population density. I mentioned that earlier in the final India map. All kinds of new urban land cover data. The nighttime lights map, which I'll talk more about on Monday. Data on impervious surfaces and land uses. And also, I didn't put it in my list, but I put up the World Bank connectivity map earlier, measuring accessibility, which is based on a very complex algorithm. That's also potentially very productive. And so these geospatial approaches, one problem is that they're dominated by a kind of cartographic positivism, which I alluded to at the outset of the lecture. The idea that you can just simply assemble layers and layers of indicators, and that'll give you somehow a composite picture. And I see that with a lot of my students. You get these elaborate composite maps, but then when you start to ask, well, which indicators, which layers of the composite are most fundamental, it actually gets a little bit tricky, because every layer is not as operationally significant. And ultimately, you need a theoretical perspective through which to decide which among these indicators. So some in the room might say, well, I want to combine nighttime lights with urban land cover, which most urban land cover data uses nighttime lights to try to develop it. So, okay, we could have that conversation. But what about ambient population density? What about connectivity? So the point is, this strategy is productive, but without an engagement with the theoretical question of what we're trying to do and what the urban is and what urbanization is, it's actually radically incomplete. And that leads to the third strategy, which it won't surprise you is the one that I'm kind of obsessed with, which is to explode the theoretical categories and invent new mappings of the worldwide urban condition. So it's not incompatible with escape route 1 or 2, but it's basically a hypothesis, which is to say that maybe we need to take a step back from the idea of urbanization as cityization and ask some questions, which I'll be developing on Monday in more detail, about what is the urban, and in what sense is urbanization not only a process of cityization, but also a process that involves a variety of other sociospatial and ecological transformations. So this is, again, the standard model, which, again, I would argue, I think it's astonishing and very depressing. This is the dominant, excuse me, this is the dominant understanding of urbanization in mainstream urban social science, urban humanities, and the design disciplines. And I'm kind of saying, well, let's take a step back from it. We may need to come back to it, but let's take a step back from it and ask, what is the you? What is the you? And we have to ask, where do the boundaries begin and where do they end? So I'm going to conclude the lecture with just starting points. I've done a kind of deconstruction, and hopefully the starting points will make you curious enough to convince you to come back on Monday night and hear a little more about where they lead. So these are kind of methodological starting points for the kind of alternative, what is the you approach that I'm interested in. So instead of talking about the city in the singular, maybe we need a pluralization of conceptualizations of agglomeration. Concentration is a relative, not absolute condition. Density is a relative, not absolute condition. It depends on the scale at which you're measuring, and it depends on what the indicator is. And again, those are fundamental questions that need to be theoretically defined. They're not ontologically or empirically defined for us. So my starting point is simply to say, instead of talking about the city, let's think about agglomeration, concentration, densification as a key process connected to urbanization. But then we've got to analyze historically and geographically patterns and pathways of agglomeration that are mediated through diverse political, cultural, ecological, and contingent struggles and conditions. So that's a starting point, which I think is, we can't even go there if we work with the idea of the city, because if we talk about the city, we already know what the outcome is before we've studied the process. That's one. Two, and I've alluded to this briefly in this lecture, but this will become central to my whole approach. Urban agglomeration is not the whole story of urbanization. So it is cityization, if we can say cities in the pluralization, so agglomeration in many forms, but it's intertwined primarily, fundamentally, not secondarily or contingently, but primarily, essentially intertwined with infrastructural, sociospatial, ecological transformations outside the big population centers. So I'm going to develop some ideas about extended urbanization, so that we've always got to connect what we see happening and what we're trying to do and transform within big population centers to diverse, let's just call them for now, hinterland spaces. So we got into some interesting discussions about that at the port today. What if we loosen the equation of urbanization with city growth? So again, it's very difficult semantically, at least in the Anglo-American world, but I think also in other linguistic universes, to loosen that equation. Because in so many discourses, when you say urbanization, it's just people think, oh, you're talking about cities. And I'm arguing we need to loosen it. And again, to underscore, the point is not that urbanization does not have anything to do with cities. It's not the argument. The building and transformation of cities is a fundamental dimension. And I'm going to call that concentrated urbanization. But equally important are the various sociospatial and infrastructural and ecological transformations that happen outside the city, but which support and result from city growth. And then the final starting point, which is already kind of implicit in what I've said, is what if we internalize the non-city? I put it in quotation marks because we don't really know what that is, into the heart of the theory of urbanization. So in other words, the theory of urbanization has to deal with planetary, sociospatial, infrastructural, ecological transformations, built and unbuilt environments. Terrestrial, oceanic, subterranean, atmospheric. I would extend it pretty far. And we don't really know, I believe, how to theorize those terrains. We've got a lot of different categories and approaches, but I don't think we have a coherent theory. And to some degree, the search for such a theory is blocked by the use of these kind of rigid and kind of, in some ways, totalizing concepts like that of the rural. So the idea of planetary urbanization is is kind of what emerges from that line of critique. And let me just end, I've got some other things, but let me just end with one other clarification about that viewpoint, which again I'll develop further next time, which is that when I talk about planetary urbanization, I'm absolutely not talking about like the Death Star, like a continuous urban film spread across the whole planet. And I'm not talking about the spread of any singular anything across the whole planet. For me, planetary urbanization is a way into the question of uneven spatial development and variegation, and the multiplication of sociospatial arrangements and forms. It's a perspective through which to study the systemic production of difference across places and territories. So thank you all very much for listening so patiently. That was probably about an hour. I'm grateful to everyone for staying so long, so late on a Friday night. And I don't know is there any time left for questions, or do we just save that for another occasion? I'm certainly eager to hear your reactions if you have any. But thank you all very much. Perfect. Floor is open. Yes, please.
You've been very kind to hint at what's in people's minds when they think of things. And when speaking of the next step, like once it is established that the world, let's say, is 55 by the very
Yep.
50% urban. What do they do with that? What are the different things that
Exactly.
people do with knowing that?
Yep, exactly.
What did they get funding to do?
Exactly. Should I just repeat the question since it may not have been on the mic? So the question was basically, what do people do with this concept that I've been criticizing? In other words, there's this widely dominant idea that we live in a majority urban world. The question is kind of, okay, once they have that idea and they think it's toxic and self-evident, what do they do with it? Fundamental question. And basically, so this idea has had different political and economic and spatial functions since Kingsley Davis's time. And that's an absolutely fascinating question, is to inquire into the ways in which that idea of majority urban world and the kind of drive towards urbanization has operated in different development projects, economic development projects, and in different design traditions. But let me just address the contemporary moment, which is what I'm most kind of concerned about and obsessed with. In the contemporary moment, what I see happening, and again, it happens in different forms around the world, whether it's North America is kind of, in some ways, an exceptional case, but in other zones of the world, the project is basically to promote mega urbanization, mega densification. And to do so, that's a political project that involves using law, that involves using design, that involves using investment strategies, and so forth. But it's presenting that politically desired outcome as a universal necessity and as something that's modern and progressive and good for everybody. And what I mean by mega urbanization is basically, or mega cityization is probably a more precise, definitely a more precise way to put it, is that you essentially depopulate the countryside, in quotation marks, the rural. You turn the countryside or the rural into something like a zone of industrial supply, of food, of materials, of waste management, in terms of the other side of metabolism. Or you turn it into what Naomi Klein calls a sacrifice zone. In other words, there are certain forms of ecological degradation that are connected to modern capitalism. Many of them occur all around us, right here within big cities, but some of the most destructive ones, like the tar sands in northern Alberta, Canada, which I'll talk about on Monday, is a sacrifice zone. It's full obliteration of ecological conditions. So on the one hand, you do that, and then meanwhile, you roll out various policy regimes that make it increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to survive, to make a living off the land, or simply in a small or medium-sized town, such that there are various kinds of economic pressures to depopulate the countryside and relocate people to the big cities and towns. So this gets me going, actually, because in that sense, when we talk about an urban age, it's a euphemism. It's a euphemism for an incredibly violent dispossession of people from ecological regions, from territories, from inherited life worlds. It connects to struggles of indigenous peoples that go back, obviously, centuries, but it also connects to struggles over subsistence agriculture and smallholders who are trying to maintain sustainable ways of life, and which are being threatened and enclosed and obliterated by agribusiness and various kinds of state-supported enclosures. So that really goes to the heart of the matter of the politics, and I think that kind of a question, again, that needs to be debated and discussed within development studies, which also seems to take for granted urbanization as inevitable and good. But I think it also needs to be debated about in design, because in the design disciplines, it has an interesting and complex history, but there's a tendency to focus on, to any tendency there are counter tendencies. So I'm aware that this is a dangerous generalization, but there's a tendency to focus on the big urban centers as the sites of kind of innovative and creative intervention. And what about the redesign of agrarian and extractive landscapes? What about the redesign of waste management? What about the redesign of the rural economy? Like, one of my favorite things that I say probably on a weekly, if not daily basis since I moved to teaching in a design school is that the world economy, the capitalist world economy, is a design problem. And we need to confront that in the design disciplines and not just leave it up to the economists who have a very different way of thinking about in what sense it's a design problem. So thank you for asking me that, because it goes to the heart of some of my own normative and political orientations and concerns. Other observations, questions, criticisms? Yes, Rudy, please.
Clearly, your last statement makes it clear how actually the design disciplines may be informed by your project. Yep. My question is that now that you are at the GSD, how do you see the design disciplines helping your project? How do they facilitate what you are doing? Right?
Yeah. Right. So let me say a couple things about that. But first before I talk about my project, just another thing about the design disciplines in relation to these issues. So I teach history and theory of urban planning and urban interventions, we call it, as I mentioned. And one of the things that I really enjoy, one of the themes that I really enjoy teaching, which goes right to the heart of a lot of these issues, is modernism. How do you teach the history of modernism in a couple of weeks? It's obviously huge, complex, controversial. One of the arguments I try to make about modernism is quite relevant to this kind of conversation too. Whatever we think about modernism as an approach to planning, as an approach to the built environment, society, and design, modernism was a moment in the history of all the design disciplines in which the meaning and the social and political significance of design was fundamentally reconceptualized. In other words, it wasn't just a new approach to design. It was a new approach to what design is and can be. It was ambitious, and I think many of us would argue it was too ambitious to the point of being hubristic and destructive. But to me, that's fundamental. And part of what I'm trying to argue in pretty much all my classes is that we need, and again, I don't think I'm alone in making this argument. I think many of you are making versions of this argument in your own teaching, your own practices. But I am someone who agrees we need to radically re-envision what is and what can and what should design be today in relation to our challenges, whether it's the ones that I was just referring to, or obviously, here in Miami and at a school like this, you grapple on a daily basis with questions about urbanization, the built environment, and climate change. We need to re-envision the way that design conceptualizes the non-human, the weather, the climate, in relation to urbanization, the built environment, and design. So in a certain way, we need to radically reimagine not just the content of our fields, but the social function, the intellectual constitution, the political constitution of the field. But in terms of my work, this will come out more on Monday, but there are a variety of different ways, but I would say the most important way, and in some ways the most generative way in which working with designers has just radically reconfigured my own relationship to developing urban theory, is the way that I use visualization. So I've had a bunch of visuals up here, but I'm going to drill a lot deeper into the question of visualization as a tool of theory building, which a few of you who may have heard me speak in geography last year heard me develop some ideas about. But basically that in the Urban Theory Lab, part of what we do, part of what has emerged as our method, is to use visualization as a way to test out certain concepts that we've been developing. So like I mentioned, this concept of extended urbanization, I'll develop it later. I'll develop it in more detail on Monday. That concept is one that in order to see how it might illuminate changes that we're trying to study, our method has been to develop a whole range of different visualizations at different scales, different sites, and different indicators. So it's been incredibly fascinating for me, also as a way to collaborate with designers who obviously work in a very visual way and have expertise and technical capacities related to spatial visualization. Too often, the field of visual studies is delinked from sort of meta-theoretical reflection. And it turns out that when you actually embed a very reflexive approach to theory with visual experimentation, it actually opens up some pretty interesting horizons. Anyone else? Anybody want to push back? You guys are very gentle, and I appreciate that because I get beat up for some of these ideas. I get beat up particularly in geography these days. Designers seem more open to, architects in particular seem more open to a little theoretical experimentation. I think it's part of the culture. But in geography, I'm getting some pushback is a mild way to describe what I'm experiencing. But it's okay. It's interesting. Anyone at all?
Monday.
Well, maybe we can continue with a few conversations with you individually, but thank you very much. This was very stimulating and interesting. We'll see you Monday.